The galactic medical consensus was unanimous. This cub had a 0.03% chance of survival. Multiple internal injuries, massive blood loss. Every readout screamed terminal. But when human veterinarian Marcus Webb looked at those same numbers, he saw something nobody else did. He saw a fight worth having. This is the story of how one man's stubborn refusal to accept impossible rewrote galactic medicine forever. What happened when he said those 3 words that changed everything? Picture Kepler station floating out. There around Kepler 442b, this gleaming medical hub where statistics usually get the last word. They've got tech so advanced it can diagnose your existential crisis before you even feel it coming. You know the type: clean lines, quiet halls, the kind of place where hope gets processed, not felt. So when the emergency transport docked, nobody expected a fight. They expected paperwork. What they got was a Zephyrin cub, a mix of species that shouldn't work but somehow does. Tiger stripes, retriever ears, delicate butterfly wings now crumpled and torn. It looked like something a kid would dream up. After too much sugar, only this kid's dream was lying broken on a med table, barely holding on. Its vitals were a horror show. Internal bleeding in 3 places, shattered bone, ruptured organs. The monitor kept flashing red like some kind of alarm nobody needed. The readouts weren't just bad, they were final. Probability of survival sat at 0. So 3%. You don't need a medical degree to understand what that means. It's the kind of number that makes clinicians start talking about memorial services instead of treatment plans. But then you noticed the breathing. Shallow, ragged, stubborn. The cub's sides rose and fell in a rhythm that defied the numbers on the screen. It wasn't giving up. Even with half its blood volume gone, wings bent all wrong, it was still fighting. That's the thing about life. It doesn't always care what the charts say. This wasn't some abstract medical case. This was someone's kid. You could feel it in the room, this tension between cold protocol and raw emotion. The station administrators were already hovering, murmuring about resource allocation, efficiency metrics, the usual bureaucratic hum. Meanwhile, the cub kept breathing, each gasp a quiet rebellion. Around it stood the latest in galactic medical tech: regeneration fields, nano-menders, bioscanners that could map a thought. All of it sterile, precise, and utterly useless in the face of sheer biological will. It was like watching a symphony of machines play to an empty hall while one small animal refused to die quietly. That's when Marcus Webb walked in. Human, of course. You could tell by the way he moved. No glide, no hover, just footsteps. He didn't look at the screens first. He looked at the cub, took in the torn wings, the labored breath, the faint pulse at its throat. Where everyone else saw probability, he saw persistence. He didn't say anything dramatic, not yet. Just stood, there, taking it all in. The high-tech helplessness, the bureaucratic hum, the fragile breathing animal in the middle of it all. You could see it in his eyes. He wasn't calculating odds. He was making a choice. The room felt different with him in it. Sharper, somehow. Like the air itself had shifted from resignation to possibility. The machines kept flashing their dire warnings. But now, there was a counterweight. A human one. He reached out, didn't even put on gloves, just laid a hand lightly on the cub's side. Felt the heartbeat himself, like he needed to verify what the sensors were too polite to lie about. Then he looked up, and you knew. Whatever came next, it wasn't going to follow the manual. You know how every system has that one person who doesn't quite fit? The square peg in the round hole, the wrench in the gears, the guy who brings manual tools to a laser surgery? That was Marcus Webb in Kepler Station's medical wing. While everyone else moved with the smooth efficiency of practiced protocol, Marcus had this way of pausing, of looking, of actually touching things. It was unsettling. His team was a study in galactic medical excellence. Dr. Vexi, for instance, a being of crystallized energy, all sharp angles and refracted light, processing data streams with a mind that saw the universe as a series of solvable equations. Emotion was a variable to be eliminated, a contaminant in the pure sample of logic. Then there was Grumble, the nurse, a gelatinous, slug-like species that communicated through precise patterns in its extruded slime, efficient, odorless, and completely unambiguous. These were the best in their fields, creatures of precision and predictability. And then there was the human. Marcus didn't diagnose. He listened. He'd place a hand on a patient's side, not for a scan, but to feel the tremor of a heartbeat, the shallow rasp of a breath. Where Vexy saw a hemoglobin count, Marcus saw pallor. Where Grumble's slime trails mapped vital signs, Marcus's instincts mapped fear. His toolkit wasn't just instruments. It was empathy, a gut feeling, a stubborn refusal to see a living thing as just a set of failing numbers. Galactic medicine had a simple rule: detachment saves lives. Getting emotionally invested was seen as the quickest path to error, to clouded judgment. It was a sterile field in every sense of the word. The best clinicians were calm, clear, and distant. A patient was a biological system to be repaired, a puzzle to be solved. Grief was for afterward, handled by different specialists. The system was clean, it was proven, and it was about to meet its most irritating obstacle. Marcus operated on a completely different frequency. He believed the emotional state of a patient was a vital sign nobody was monitoring. Fear could spike cortisol, despair could suppress the immune system, and a will to fight could sometimes jury-rig systems back online that the scanners said were dead. He viewed that connection, that messy, unquantifiable bond between healer and patient, as the most powerful diagnostic and therapeutic tool in existence. It wasn't in any manual. It was just something humans did. This set up a quiet, constant tension in the medbay. You could see it in the way Vexy's crystalline form would flicker with a disapproving violet hue when Marcus spent too long at a bedside. You could see it in the way Grumble's slime trails would form tight, efficient circles around Marcus's workspace, a silent critique of the emotional clutter. They weren't enemies, they were just speaking different languages. One spoke the language of data, the other the language of duty. You're seeing the whole philosophy of galactic medicine through this one team. It's a microcosm of a civilization that mastered the universe by trusting logic above all else. They conquered disease with math, not hope. They extended lifespans through genetic recalibration, not pep talks. And into this temple of reason walks a human who still believes in the power of a hand on a furrowed brow. Marcus's difference wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the one variable the system never accounted for. It was the catalyst. He was the anomaly that could force an upgrade, the bug that reveals a fundamental weakness in the code. He wasn't trying to break the rules. He just operated on a set of principles the rulebook hadn't been written to include. The system, however, was built to maintain equilibrium. It was designed to smooth out anomalies, not learn from them. Protocols existed for a reason. They were safe. They were predictable. They minimized loss. Marcus's kind of medicine, the messy, hands-on, emotionally driven, stubbornly hopeful kind, wasn't just unconventional. To the guardians of galactic medical tradition, it was borderline heresy. It was a risk that threatened the very foundation of their success. They weren't just not ready for it, they were programmed to reject it. Let me tell you about cold, hard galactic statistics. They don't deal in maybes or what-ifs. They deal in certainties based on trillions of data points across thousands of species. When the system calculates a 0.03% survival chance, it's not being pessimistic. It's being brutally honest. That number represents the sum total of every known medical intervention failing against biological reality. The team assembled around the Cub's biobed, the air humming with the quiet judgment of machines. Dr. Vexy's crystalline form pulsed with a soft analytical blue. The diagnosis was delivered without inflection, a simple recitation of fact. Tissue degradation exceeds regenerative thresholds. Hemoglobin levels incompatible with neural function. Systemic failure is imminent. There was no malice in the statement, just the weight of inevitability. Hope, Vexy would later clarify, is an emotional response with no correlating data point. It doesn't increase blood oxygen or mend shattered bone. The most logical course was to minimize suffering, to allow the system to fail with dignity. Grumble, meanwhile, was already processing the next phase. A new trail of glistening slime spelled out a grimly efficient sequence on the floor. Resource reallocation protocol initiate. Memorial preparation advised. Sterilization cycle pending. It was standard procedure. The medbay was a place of finite resources: energy, time, bed space. Investing more in a 0.03% probability wasn't just emotionally illogical, it was mathematically irresponsible. The machines were saying no. The protocols were saying no. The sheer crushing weight of galactic medical precedent was saying no. Every data point added to the chorus. The digestive tract was essentially liquefied, a mess of acid and ruined tissue. Blood loss had passed the point of no return minutes ago, according to every textbook ever written on Zephyrian hybrid physiology. The wings weren't just broken. Their delicate neural lattice was severed in multiple places, ensuring that even if by some miracle the cub lived, it would never fly. The screens showed a cascade of red indicators, a visual symphony of failure. Each blink was another system shutting down, another biological process conceding defeat. The family was contacted. The message was clear, delivered with the sterile compassion the galaxy preferred. Prepare for an end-of-life ceremony. The case was officially classified as terminal non-intervention. This classification is a big deal. It triggers a whole series of automated processes, from bereavement counseling assignments to the scheduling of the station's interment pod. It's the system's way of closing the book. This wasn't just the opinion of one doctor or one nurse. This was the consensus of the entire medical AI, cross-referenced with the Galactic Health Database. It was the incontrovertible conclusion. You could feel the pressure in the room to just accept it. The pull to follow the path of least resistance, to do what was expected, to not make a scene. It's the easier choice, the cleaner choice. The numbers were all there, laid out in bright, undeniable glyphs. To argue was to argue with reality itself. Everyone was ready to move on, to file the case away as another tragic but statistically inevitable loss. The machines began their low-power hum, preparing for the next emergency, already writing this one off. But Marcus was still looking at the cub. Not at the screens reflecting its failure, but at the animal itself. His hand was still on its side, feeling the faint, stubborn tremor of a heartbeat that refused to sync with the doom on the monitors. He saw the slight twitch of an ear, the shallow, ragged pull of air into ruined lungs. The numbers said one thing, but his eyes saw another. He saw a flicker. Not a data point, not a percentage. A flicker of pure, undiluted life, clinging on with everything it had. Everyone else saw a terminal case. Marcus Webb saw a patient. He saw a fight. And the pressure to concede, the weight of all that cold, hard logic just seemed to bounce right off him. He took a slow breath, looked from the despairing readouts to the determined creature fighting beneath his hand, and then he finally spoke. His voice was calm, flat, and it cut through the clinical hum of the room like a knife. Not on my watch. What does not on my watch really mean in the face of impossibility? It's not a declaration of victory. It's a line in the sand. It's the moment a person stops arguing with the numbers and starts arguing with reality itself. For Marcus, it meant a fundamental shift in priorities. The galactic medical mindset viewed compassion as a gentle endpoint, a soft landing for an inevitable crash. Marcus was reframing it as the engine itself, a relentless, stubborn, sometimes illogical force of effort. He moved to the main diagnostic console, his fingers flying across the interface. He wasn't dismissing the data. He was interrogating it. He pulled up the hemoglobin decay rate, the tissue degradation models, the probability matrices. But where Vexy saw a final verdict, Marcus saw a set of problems. This number assumes standard transfusion protocols, he muttered, zooming in on a plasma viscosity graph. What if we don't use standard protocols? He wasn't conceding to mathematical probability. He was searching for the cracks in its logic, the tiny decimal places where a miracle might hide. Dr. Vexy's crystalline form flickered with a sharp indigo light. The models are not assumptions, Dr. Webb. They are conclusions derived from observable, repeatable phenomena across 19 documented cases with identical trauma profiles. Hope is an emotional response. It has no measurable effect on cellular regeneration or hemodynamic stability. The argument was delivered with the cool, dispassionate clarity of a supercomputer stating the time. It was irrefutable, and it hung in the air between them. the entire weight of galactic medical science backing it up. Marcus didn't even look up from the screen. His focus was absolute. "Sometimes the most scientific thing you can do is ignore the science," he said, his voice low and steady. It was a heresy, a provocation. When the data says something is impossible, but the patient in front of you is still trying, sometimes science has to yield to will. Theirs and yours. He wasn't advocating for magic. He was proposing a different kind of logic, one that accepted the data but refused to be limited by it. A logic that said if the rules can't save a life, you break the rules and write new ones. This was the core of the clash laid bare. It was data versus determination. The entire galaxy had built its medical philosophy on the first principle, that emotion clouded judgment, that the clearest path to truth was through dispassionate analysis. And here was a human, a biological creature infamous for its irrational attachments, suggesting that the very thing they'd spent millennia filtering out of their equations might be the most crucial variable of all. It was empathy-driven care crashing headfirst into data-driven medicine. You could see the tension in the room thicken. Vexy stood rigid, a statue of crystallized logic. Grumble's slime trails paused, the patterns frozen mid-calculation. The machines continued their grim reports, unaware of the philosophical war being waged over their outputs. It wasn't a loud argument. It was a quiet, fundamental disagreement about the nature of reality, of life, of what it meant to heal. Marcus's refusal wasn't some dramatic rebellion for its own sake. It was the application of a different kind of reasoning, a human calculus that factored in variables like fight and spirit, things that didn't have a standard unit of measurement in the galactic database. He finally straightened up from the console. He'd seen enough. The numbers were terrible. The odds were astronomical. The path forward was uncharted and likely violated about 17 different station safety protocols. None of that mattered anymore. He had crossed a threshold. The battle was no longer just against the cub's injuries or the failing systems of its body. It was a battle against death itself, and just as importantly against the dogma that insisted this death was acceptable, logical, even prudent. He turned to face them, and his expression had changed. The contemplation was gone, replaced by a focused intensity. The debate was over. The work was about to begin. He had committed. Fully, completely, and without a backup plan. He'd drawn his line, and he was standing on it. But the real test wasn't winning the argument. It was proving his crazy hypothesis right. It was taking that defiant stand and then having to actually back it up with actions that could very well fail spectacularly. The hard part, the messy, bloody, improbable part, was next. So how does human medicine actually differ from galactic healing tech? Imagine the difference between a concert pianist playing a perfect pre-composed sonata and a jazz musician riffing on a broken instrument in a burning building. One is about precision and perfection. The other is about adaptation and sheer nerve. Galactic medicine is the pianist. It relies on energy-based healing matrices, focused biobeams, and nanoswarms that do the work from a distance. It's clean, it's sterile, and it's utterly useless when the patient's biology is too scrambled for the machines to get a clean lock. Marcus bypassed all of it. He didn't request a surgical suite. He just cleared a space on the main biobed console. He called for a physical kit, not a laser scalpel but a blade of honed steel, not a cauterizing beam but clamps and sutures. The tools looked ancient and brutal next to the humming, glowing tech surrounding them. They were things you held in your hand, things that required pressure and skill and feel. Dr. Vexy's form flickered with a confused amber light. The non-invasive protocols are... Marcus cut her off, not with words, but with action. He picked up the scalpel. "Watch me," he said, and it wasn't a boast. It was an instruction, and then he got his hands dirty. Literally. Galactic medicine is built on a foundation of sterile fields and untouched tissue. The ideal procedure leaves no mark, requires no incision. Marcus plunged his hands into the mess. Blood, and something that wasn't quite blood but served the same purpose for a Zephyrin hybrid, coated his gloves, his sleeves. He wasn't observing the damage on a screen. He was feeling it. His fingers traced the ragged edges of a ruptured organ, probed the splintered ends of bone, located a bleeder that the scanners had missed because it was buried behind a mass of clotted fluid. This was tactile, messy, profoundly physical work. He wasn't just operating. He was reassembling a life piece by piece with his own hands. You could see the clash in the room. a silent culture war happening over an open body cavity. On one side, the humming, pristine technology of 1,000 advanced worlds, capable of miracles but bound by its own perfect logic. On the other, a single human with a bloody kit of metal tools operating on instinct, touch, and a stubborn refusal to quit. It was high-tech convenience meeting gritty, desperate necessity. The machines could have regrown the tissue in minutes if the body was stable. But the body wasn't stable. It was falling apart. So Marcus did the one thing the machines couldn't. He held it together. He adapted on the fly. A Zephyrin liver isn't shaped like a human's. Its vascular system follows a fractal pattern that makes no intuitive sense. The standard suturing technique for a terrestrial mammal would have torn its unique connective tissue to shreds. So he modified his approach mid-stitch, creating a new pattern. A hybrid of human technique and alien anatomy he was basically inventing right there on the spot. It was a monumentally risky improvisation. One wrong move, one misplaced clamp, and he'd cause more damage than the original accident. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his movements sure and deliberate, a stark contrast to the panicked flashing of the life sign monitors. The team watched, a frozen audience to this heresy. Dr. Vexy was a statue of conflicted logic, her crystalline facets reflecting the bloody scene in 100 horrified angles. The data said this was catastrophic. The protocol said it was forbidden, but the human's confidence was its own unsettling data point. Grumble had stopped producing slime trails altogether, a sign of profound cognitive distress. They were uneasy, baffled, but also undeniably intrigued. This wasn't in the manual. This was something new, something alarmingly, fascinatingly alive. The surgery itself was an act of physical defiance. Every clamp he set was a rejection of the statistical fate laid out by the computers. Every suture was a stitch taken against inevitability. He wasn't just repairing tissue. He was sewing shut the mouth of probability itself, forcing it to swallow its own grim prognosis. The room, once a temple to quiet, efficient loss, was now a workshop of loud, messy, improbable hope. The air smelled of ozone and blood and human sweat. He stabilized the major bleeder, patched the worst of the organ damage, and managed to set the largest of the bone fractures with a series of tiny, precise clips. The cub's vital signs, while still critical, stopped their precipitous nosedive. They wobbled, they held. For the first time since the cub arrived, the monitors showed a line that wasn't trending straight down. It was a temporary fix, a desperate patch job on a sinking ship, but it was a fix. Marcus had bought minutes, maybe even an hour. He took a breath, wiping his forehead with the back of a bloody sleeve, and looked at the mess he'd made and the life he'd temporarily preserved. The immediate obvious fire was out. But the ship was still taking on water from a dozen smaller leaks, and he was out of standard plugs. The real improvisation, the part where he had to build new tools out of spare parts and sheer nerve, was just about to start. What happens when technology fails and ingenuity takes over? It's not about having the right tool for the job. It's about making the job fit the tools you've got. Marcus looked at the humming, pristine machines around him and saw not solutions but parts. The cub's unique biology was rejecting the standard universal plasma. The blood loss was still critical. The scanners were useless for the kind of manual, tactile fix he needed. So he stopped asking the machines for permission and started treating them like a hardware store. He jury-rigged a new cardiac monitor first. The standard one was designed for non-invasive readings, but he needed to see the direct millisecond feedback of his manual work. He pulled components from 3 different machines, splicing wires and bypassing safety protocols, with a focus that was terrifying in its calm precision. He wasn't just using equipment, he was repurposing it, forcing it to perform functions its designers never imagined. The console screens, once displaying clean, separate data streams, now showed a chaotic fusion of overlapping readouts, a mosaic of desperation and genius. Then came the blood substitute. Galactic medical doctrine held that you never mixed plasma types. The results were unpredictable, potentially toxic. Marcus grabbed 4 different universal types and started pouring them into a filtration unit he'd rewired. The computer immediately flashed error messages, a frantic red warning that what he was doing violated 17 separate health codes. He ignored them, adjusting the proportions by sight and feel, creating a concoction that the system's logic said couldn't exist. It was a formula born of necessity, a blend that made no sense on paper but might just work in a dying cub's veins. He hooked it up to the transfusion line. The machine screamed in protest. The cub's circulatory system, starved and failing, accepted it. His most brazen act was the tissue regenerator. It was a magnificent piece of tech, designed to stimulate cellular growth from a distance, useless for the precise structural repair the cub's wings and internal tissues needed. So he took it apart. With a series of quick, brutal adjustments, he converted the emitter array into a high-frequency, microscopic sewing machine. It was a perversion of its intended function. A tool for gentle healing turned into a device for aggressive reconstruction. He used it to stitch together the delicate neural lattice of the wings, a task so fine that doing it by hand would have taken hours they didn't have. 17 vital signs flashed across the chaotic screens, a relentless strobe of crisis. Heart rate, oxygen saturation, neural activity, cellular decay, each one a ticking clock. Every second was a battle, a choice between which alarm to address first. The medbay looked less like a sterile operating room and more like the engine room of a ship taking on water, with Marcus as the chief engineer desperately rerouting power and patching leaks. The air crackled with the strain of overtaxed systems and human focus. Dr. Vexy's discomfort was a physical presence. Her crystalline form cycled through colors of alarm and confusion. She noted, her voice a tight beam of pure logic, that Webb was using the equipment in ways it was never intended to function. This wasn't just a violation of protocol. It was a violation of physics, of design philosophy. It was chaos. But she kept watching. Her scientific curiosity, that core driver of her being, was overriding her programmed need for order. She was witnessing something impossible, and a part of her, despite everything, needed to see how it ended. Grumble's stress levels, usually measured in the frantic pace of its slime production, actually decreased. The initial panic was giving way to a watchful stillness. The slug-like nurse was processing this new data stream. Not the failure of standard procedures, but the success of a wildly unconventional one. It was a variable the nurse's programming had no algorithm for. This wasn't just surgery anymore. It was creative defiance under pressure. It was the raw essence of human ingenuity, not as some abstract concept, but as a bloody, practical, life-saving force. You could see it in every jerry-rigged connection and every repurposed tool. It was the refusal to be limited by what something was supposed to do, and the determination to make it do what you needed it to do. And then, against all odds, it started working. The aggressive optimism began paying off. The cub's cellular regeneration rate ticked upward. Its blood pressure, once a flat line threatening to happen, began to stabilize. The frantic beeping of the heart monitor settled into a steadier, stronger rhythm. The numbers on the screen, once a unanimous verdict of death, began to show the faint green shoots of recovery. The cub's breathing deepened, losing that terrifying shallow rasp. The awful gray pallor that had settled over its fur began to recede, replaced by a faint returning warmth. It was a fragile improvement, a house of cards built on a foundation of violated protocols and repurposed machinery, but it was real. For the first time, the impossible started to look possible. The internal crisis was receding. The immediate fire was out. But just as Marcus took a half-second to breathe, to look at the stabilized readings with something resembling relief, the external pressure they'd all forgotten about decided to make its grand entrance. The medbay doors hissed open. The bureaucratic onslaught had arrived right on schedule. Just when the cub's vitals began to show a flicker of something other than terminal decline, the hiss of the medbay doors announced the arrival of reality. Not the biological kind, the bureaucratic kind. Administrator Claxon entered, and you could feel the temperature in the room drop by 5 degrees. He was a tall, slender being that brought to mind an octopus that had been meticulously pressed and folded into a crisp administrative uniform, all sharp angles and an air of profound inconvenience. He didn't walk so much as process into the room, each movement efficient and devoid of wasted energy. He held a data slate in one of his many appendages, its screen glowing with the official seal of the Galactic Medical Review Board. His voice, when he spoke, had the dry, rustling quality of ancient paperwork being shuffled in a distant archive. He announced a cease and desist order. The words were formal, delivered in 3 different galactic standard languages for maximum legal weight. The case, he stated, was officially classified as terminal non-intervention. Continued efforts were deemed a waste of resources and a clear violation of ethical treatment protocols. The board demanded an immediate cessation of all medical activities outside of palliative comfort measures. The message was clear, cold, and absolute. The system had reviewed the anomaly and was moving to correct it. The tension in the room, which had been a tight knot of medical focus, now stretched into a razor wire of conflict. It was innovation crashing headlong into stifling regulation. This wasn't just about a differing medical opinion anymore. It was a direct challenge to the established power structure. Klaxon represented the entire weight of galactic medical law, a system built on precedent, procedure, and the cold calculus of acceptable loss. Marcus, covered in blood and surrounded by jury-rigged machinery, represented a chaotic, unpredictable variable. As if on cue, the drama deepened. The Cubs family arrived. Lord Zaxnall and Lady Quinara entered the med bay, their postures radiating a grief they had already resigned themselves to. They were elegant beings, their forms suggesting a nobility that transcended species, but their expressions were shattered. They had come not to hope but to mourn. They had received the official notification, the one that advises families to plan for closure. They expected to find a quiet room, a peaceful end, a chance to say a final goodbye to their child. They believed they were honoring its passing with dignity and acceptance. What they found was a bloody, chaotic workshop of defiance. Their expressions shifted from sorrow to confusion, then to a kind of horrified dismay. They insisted on peace. They pleaded for closure. This frantic, undignified struggle against the inevitable was, to them, a further trauma. They saw not a fight for life, but a violation of a natural, if tragic, order. Their presence added a terrible emotional weight to Klaxon's bureaucratic decree. It wasn't just the law saying stop. It was the parents. Marcus didn't even pause. He was elbow-deep in the delicate work of reconnecting a severed neural cluster in the Cub's wing. He didn't look up at Klaxon or the grieving parents. His focus remained entirely on the tiny, precise movements of his hands. When Klaxon finished his pronouncement, the only sound was the hum of overtaxed equipment and the Cub's shallow, steadying breath. Then Marcus spoke, his voice calm and flat, cutting through the heavy silence. Noted, a single word. Then, file the disciplinary paperwork. I'll review it tomorrow. He said it with the casual air of someone postponing a dentist appointment. Disciplinary action was a tomorrow problem. The life trembling under his hands was a right-now problem. He prioritized the Cub over the protocol, the patient over the procedure, the immediate need over the inevitable consequence. You felt the collision in that moment. It was the sound of a single stubborn will hitting an immovable object. It wasn't just about medicine anymore. It was about ethics under pressure. It was about the moment you have to choose between doing what you're told and doing what you know is right, even if it costs you everything. Marcus had just doubled down, deepening the stakes from a professional disagreement to a full-blown act of rebellion. He had drawn a line and he was standing on it alone. But then something shifted. Lord Zaxnall, who had been standing rigid with grief and frustration, watched Marcus's hands. He saw the absolute, unshakable focus. He saw the care in every minute movement. He saw the blood on the human sleeves not as a mark of barbarism, but as a testament of effort. He looked from the bureaucratic entity demanding surrender to the single determined being refusing to quit. The noble's posture changed. The resignation in his eyes flickered, replaced by a dawning, desperate curiosity. He took a step forward, not toward his child to say goodbye, but toward Marcus. An unexpected alliance was forming in the most improbable of places. How do alien nobility end up assisting in emergency surgery? It starts with a look. Not a command, not a plea. A direct, quiet assessment of available resources. Marcus, his hand still working, his eyes fixed on the delicate tissue under his focus, spoke without looking up. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the frantic beeps and the tense silence of the room. He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating a need. Lord Zaxnall, your hands. I need steady pressure here, a specific rhythm. You feel the heartbeat? Match it. It wasn't a request for a mourner. It was an order for an assistant. He was taking their grief and channeling it, transforming it into action. He was giving them a job to do when all they'd been offered was a goodbye. Lord Zaxnall hesitated for only a second. The shock of being addressed not as a grieving parent, but as a useful pair of hands cut through his despair. He stepped forward, his own elegant, multi-jointed limbs looking out of place in the bloody field. But he followed Marcus's brief, precise instructions. placing his hands on his cub's side and beginning a firm, rhythmic cardiac massage. It was a critical physical intervention to maintain blood flow, a direct contradiction to the passive acceptance he'd arrived with moments before. He was no longer watching his child die. He was fighting for its life. Then Marcus turned his attention to Lady Quinara. "Your wing fingers. They're finer than any tool I have. I need retractors here and suction there." Gentle, but firm. Her delicate, almost filament-like digits, which usually served for intricate communication or delicate manipulation, were now pressed into service as medical instruments. She moved to the other side of the table, her movements initially hesitant, then growing more confident as she found the rhythm of the work. She was using her own biology, a part of her very being, to hold open her child's body so the repair could continue. It was a profound intimacy, a far cry from the sterile distance of galactic medical practice. This spontaneous recruitment didn't stop with the parents. The entire dynamic in the room shifted. Grumble, seeing the new hands-on approach, stopped its anxious hovering. It extruded a new specialized slime trail that formed a perfect, flexible seal over the cub's muzzle, improvising a ventilation system that was far more responsive to the cub's shallow breaths than the standard equipment. It was a brilliant, on-the-fly adaptation, a use of its unique biology that the medical manuals had never considered. Even Dr. Vexy was pulled into the effort. Her objections about protocol were silenced by the sheer necessity of the moment. Her analytical mind, once a barrier, became an asset. She rerouted scanner feeds, using the readings from Marcus's jury-rigged monitors to create a real-time composite map of the cub's neural activity. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was actively tracking the most delicate signs of life, providing Marcus with a data stream he desperately needed. Her crystalline form glowed with a focused, intense light, a sign of complete cognitive engagement. And then there was Administrator Claxon. He simply stood there, his data slate hanging uselessly at his side. The cease and desist order was still active on its screen, a forgotten piece of legal fiction. He had become a reluctant spectator to this cross-species effort, his bureaucratic authority rendered completely irrelevant by the raw, collaborative will unfolding in front of him. He didn't help, but he also didn't interfere. He just watched, a stark, silent monument to a system that was being bypassed in real time. This collaboration unlocked something. It was a synergy of desperate ingenuity. The noble's hands provided the physical force. The mother's unique biology provided the precise tools. The nurse's slime provided life support. And the scientist's logic provided the guiding data. The human provided the mad plan that held it all together. No single approach, no one species method could have achieved this. It was a microcosm of galactic unity forged in a life-or-death moment. You saw the potential of what could happen when different forms of intelligence and different kinds of bodies stopped arguing and started working. It wasn't just human stubbornness anymore. It was collective ingenuity. A shared purpose had overwritten 1,000 cultural and procedural differences. The team, a bizarre assembly of a bloody human crystalline scientist, slime-based nurse, and 2 noble Zephyrins using their own bodies as tools, had transcended conventional practice entirely. They were writing a new protocol on the fly in blood and hope and slime. The result was immediate and tangible. The cub's vitals, which had been wobbling on the edge, firmed up. The heart rate stabilized under Lord Zaxnall's steady massage. The oxygen levels rose thanks to Grumble's improvised vent. The neural map from Vexy showed strengthening signals. The patient was stabilizing further, moving from critical to merely grave. It was a monumental shift. The collective effort was working. They had bought more time. They had created a bubble of possibility where none should exist. But patching the physical damage was one thing. The ultimate test, the one that would determine if this impossible effort had been for nothing, was still ahead. They had stabilized the body. Now they had to see if the spark of life within it was strong enough to catch. After 3 hours, the medbay didn't feel like a place of impending death anymore. It felt like a workshop where something stubborn was being built. The air, once thick with resignation, now hummed with a different energy. The low thrum of overtaxed machinery, yes, but underneath it, something else. A fragile, persistent rhythm. Marcus, his face streaked with sweat and something that wasn't quite blood, finally straightened up. He didn't smile. He just watched the main screen, his eyes tracking a line that had stopped its death spiral. "Heart stronger," he said, his voice rough. Neural activities coming back online. Not all of it, but enough. It wasn't a celebration. It was a report from the front lines, a confirmation that the ground was finally holding. The skeptical Dr. Vexi, who had spent the last 3 hours cataloging violations of physics and protocol, was silent. Her crystalline form, which had been cycling through colors of alarm and disapproval, now held a steady contemplative blue. She wasn't looking at Marcus. She was looking at her own data stream, at the hard numbers she couldn't argue with. The patient's cellular regeneration rate had increased. The blood pressure, once a flat line threatening to happen, had stabilized. The neural activity was showing measurable improvement. The data was undeniable. She turned her faceted gaze from the screen to Marcus, then to the cub. When she spoke, her voice lacked its usual sharp certainty. It was softer, almost wondering. The approach is highly unconventional, she conceded, a statement that from her was akin to a standing ovation. But the patient is responding. The improvements are measurable. It was the closest she would ever come to admitting she was wrong. You could see the change in the whole team. Their posture shifted from rigid, practical readiness to something looser, something approaching astonished awe. Lord Zaxnull's hands, which had been mechanically performing cardiac massage, now moved with a new tenderness, a connection that went beyond instruction. Lady Quinara's delicate wing fingers, acting as retractors, held the tissue not just with firmness but with a reverent care. Grumble had stopped producing anxious slime patterns altogether, its gelatinous body simply quivering with a quiet, focused intensity as it maintained the improvised ventilation. Even Administrator Claxon, the bureaucrat, had stopped consulting his data slate. He just watched, his many appendages still a statue of bureaucratic shock. The room was no longer a collection of individuals following a plan. It was a single organism united in a shared, breathless hope. This was the convergence. Human tenacity, that stubborn refusal to quit, had met alien precision and unique biology, and together they had forged a third thing. Something new. It wasn't just medical progress on a screen. It was a narrative transformation. The story was changing right in front of them. The case was officially moving. It was sliding out of the terminal classification and into uncharted territory. The Galactic Medical Database would have to invent a new category. Prospective recovery against all statistical models. Maybe they'd just call it the Webb Protocol. Statistics, the cold, hard numbers that had declared this case closed, were being reframed in real time. They were no longer a verdict. They were just a set of problems that had been solved by a different method. The conversation was no longer about probability. It was about possibility. What was possible when you didn't accept the limits? What was possible when you used a noble's hands for cardiac massage and a mother's biology for surgical tools? The numbers were the same, but their meaning had been completely rewritten by sheer bloody-minded effort. Then came the resolution, the moment the abstract numbers made flesh. The cub's breathing, which had been a shallow mechanical rasp forced by machines and willpower, deepened into a natural rhythmic flow. The awful gray pallor that had clung to its fur like a shroud began to recede, replaced by a warm, vibrant hue that seemed to glow from within. Its prismatic fur, once dull and matted, began to brighten, each strand catching the light. But the most profound change was in its face. The cub's eyes, which had been shut in pain or unconsciousness for hours, fluttered open. They were clear, aware. They focused, not on the bright lights or the strange faces, but on Marcus, the human who had refused to let go. It was a recognizably alive patient now, not a collection of failing systems. It was a kid, looking at the person who had fought for it. The impossible had been made manifest. The fight was, against every odd, being won. The room held its breath. The moment of truth wasn't about the surgery anymore. The cutting and stitching were done. The moment of truth was about what happened next. What does it look like when a dying alien patient opens its eyes? It's not like in the stories. There's no dramatic gasp, no sudden clarity. It's slower than that, more fragile. The cub's eyelids, those delicate membranes that had been shut tight against the world of pain, simply fluttered. Once, twice, then they stayed open. The eyes beneath weren't glassy or vacant. They were clear, aware, and they focused immediately, not on the bright lights, not on the worried faces of its parents, but on Marcus. The man was still leaning over the biobed, his sleeves stained, his face a mask of exhaustion and focus. The cub's gaze locked onto him, a silent, profound acknowledgement. This was the caretaker who had refused to quit. On the monitors, the story continued. The heart rhythm, which had been a weak, thready line for so long, was now a strong, steady wave pulsing across the screen. It was a normal sinus rhythm, a textbook example of a healthy heart doing its job. The neural activity, once a chaotic mess of seizure-like spikes and terrifying flatlines, had settled into a calm, organized pattern. The brain was online, processing, aware. Grumble, ever the pragmatist, provided the running commentary. The slug-like nurse's slime trails formed a new, almost lyrical pattern on the floor. Oxygen saturation 94% and climbing. Blood pressure stabilizing within nominal parameters. Cellular vitality readings show marked improvement across all major systems. It was a dry recitation of data, but the numbers themselves were a poem. They were the numbers of a life being won back, digit by digit. Dr. Vexi watched it all, her crystalline form humming with a soft, internal light. She had been the staunchest defender of logic, the high priestess of protocol. She had argued that hope was a contaminant in the sterile field of science. Now she observed the results of that very contamination. She looked from the cub's alert eyes to the steady readouts, and then to the bloody, exhausted human at the center of it all. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was measured, analytical, but it carried the weight of a paradigm shifting. The approach is highly unconventional, she stated, the words a familiar refrain. But then she added the new part, the part that changed everything. But the patient is responding. The improvements are measurable. For her, that was the highest possible praise. It was an admission that the universe contained variables her models had never accounted for. You could feel the emotional weight in the room settle. A solid, tangible thing. It was the payoff. The 3 hours of frantic, desperate, bloody work. The defiance of bureaucracy, the repurposing of technology, the recruiting of nobles into a surgical team. All of it crystallized in this one moment. A living, breathing, watching patient where there was supposed to be a corpse. This was the victory. Not a loud, cheering victory, but a quiet, profound one. The kind that leaves you breathless and drained. The human part of the team, the part that ran on caffeine and stubbornness, finally allowed itself to feel it. There were no cheers, but there were looks. A slow, weary nod from Marcus. A shared glance of exhausted triumph between him and the nurses who had followed him into the breach. They celebrated quietly, internally, amidst the lingering chaos of wires and improvised equipment and the still-present hovering form of Administrator Claxon. The bureaucratic chaos was still there, a pending storm, but for this moment it didn't matter. The cub's survival was more than just a medical case closed. It was a personal triumph for every being in that room who had chosen to help. For Lord Zaxnol and Lady Quinara, it was their child returned from the brink. For Grumble and Vexi, it was a professional worldview violently and successfully expanded. For Marcus, it was the validation of a gut feeling, a philosophy proven right in the most extreme laboratory imaginable. And symbolically, it was a win for the idea that some fights are worth having, even when the entire galaxy says you're wrong. The cub shifted slightly on the table, a weak but deliberate movement. Its prismatic fur, once dull and matted with fluids, seemed to brighten, catching the light as if from within. It was a visual sign of the life flooding back into its system. It was going to make it. The impossible had been made routine, but saving a life is one thing. Dealing with the consequences of how you saved it is another. The aftermath of this victory was about to reshape the very foundation of galactic medicine, and not everyone was going to be happy about it. How does one impossible case change galactic medicine forever? It starts with paperwork. Of course it does. The Galactic Medical Review Board, the vast bureaucratic entity that had sent Administrator Claxon with a cease and desist order, now had to process what had happened. They couldn't ignore it. The patient was alive. Their own terminal prognosis had been defeated. So they did what bureaucracies do when faced with an undeniable, inconvenient success. They classified it. They created a new category. They called it Experimental Protocol 1 Alpha Human. It was a label, a box to put the anomaly in. It was also, in its own dry administrative way, a monument. They granted it provisional authorization. The official term for the approach was aggressive optimism therapy. You have to love the galactic talent for naming things. They take a concept as messy and human as defiant hope, and turn it into a clinical term you can file in a database. The authorization was provisional, meaning it came with a mountain of disclaimers and monitoring requirements. It was the galaxy's way of saying, "We don't understand this, we don't entirely approve of it, but we can't deny it worked, so we'll allow it under strict supervision." It was a crack in the dam. The official description of the protocol was a masterpiece of backhanded praise. It was cataloged as a treatment approach involving the systematic rejection of mathematical probability in favor of biological stubbornness. It was a phrase that both mocked and honored the human spirit in equal measure. On one hand, it sounded ridiculous, like a children's story about a little engine that could. On the other, it was a formal scientific acknowledgement that willpower, that sheer refusal to quit, was a measurable force that could alter biological outcomes. They'd taken a philosophy and given it a serial number. This was the formal recognition of the paradigm shift. It wasn't a parade. It was a line of text in a galactic database, but that line of text meant that every doctor, on every station orbiting every star, could now, theoretically with the right forms filed in triplicate, attempt the impossible. They could look at a 0.03% chance and decide to fight it instead of filing it. The system had admitted that its own logic had limits, and that humanity had found a way to operate beyond them. The effects were immediate. The Cubs case file, once a cautionary tale about resource allocation, became a beacon. It spawned consultation requests, 47 of them to be exact. Doctors and clinicians from across the galaxy, faced with their own hopeless cases, started pinging Marcus's terminal. They'd seen the reports, read the wild story about the Zephyrin hybrid, and decided to ask the one person who might say yes when the entire medical establishment said no. The request queue wasn't just a list of names. It was a map of desperation, a chart of cases the galaxy had given up on. Then the number ticked up to 48. The new one came from the Andromeda sector. The case was a crystalline moss creature suffering from terminal geometric decay. The attending physician's message was telling. They didn't ask for Dr. Webb. They asked for the crazy human who doesn't understand that impossible means impossible. It was a title, a job description. It meant the story had spread, morphing from a medical report into a legend. His methods weren't just a protocol anymore. They were a reputation. The highest honor, however, came from the Zephyrin Council itself. An invitation arrived, not to a medical conference, but to the conclave of impossible things. This wasn't a stuffy academic gathering. It was a prestigious event held once every 50 years, a celebration of achievements that shouldn't have been possible. Explorers who found routes through unmappable nebulae, engineers who built structures that defied physics, artists who created works that changed a species' perception of reality. And this cycle, the theme was humans. They'd invited Marcus Webb to stand among them. They were positioning him as a catalyst, not just for a new medical technique, but for a wider change in how the galaxy viewed its own limits. His approach, this messy, bloody, stubbornly hopeful way of doing things, was now officially a thing. It had a name, a file number, and a growing list of followers. It had changed the rules. But a philosophy is only as good as its next test. The real question wasn't if it could work once on a winged cub. The real question was if it could work again, on something even more alien, even more broken. A new crisis was always just around the corner, waiting to see if the human way was a fluke or a foundation. So what does stubborn human optimism actually do when the next impossible thing walks through the door? It doesn't rest on its laurels. It looks for the next mountain to climb. The story didn't end with the cub. A new crisis arrived, as they always do. This one was a crystalline entity, a being whose consciousness was literally woven into a geometric lattice of light and mineral. And it was shattered, not broken like bone, but fractured along conceptual lines. Its matrix spiderwebbed with cracks that galactic science said were irreparable. The damage wasn't physical in a way their tech could fix. It was like trying to glue together a shattered idea. The energy that held it together was leaking out. And the standard protocols involved palliative containment, making the being comfortable while its consciousness slowly unraveled. The fracture lines glimmered with a sickly, unstable light. They weren't just on the surface. They cut through the core of its being, disrupting the flow of information that was its equivalent of thought and life. Galactic medicine had a term for it: terminal structural decay. The prognosis was once again a flat zero, You can't suture light. You can't clamp a crack in a concept. The medical consensus was to step back, to observe the end with respectful detachment, to let physics take its inevitable course. It was the logical, the dignified, the only way. Marcus walked around the patient, studying it not as a broken thing, but as a new kind of puzzle. He didn't see an irreparable matrix. He saw a system that needed a patch, and his solution was pure, unfiltered human adaptability. He proposed they stop trying to fix it from the outside and instead become part of the solution. It was a phrase that made Dr. Vexy's crystalline form flicker with alarm. It sounded less like medicine and more like metaphysical hacking. He didn't work alone this time. He'd learned the power of the team. He enlisted Grumble, whose unique gelatinous biology could interface directly with the entity's energy field, providing a stabilizing dampener. He put Vexy on pattern recognition, her analytical mind perfect for mapping the chaotic flow of the fracturing consciousness. He even recruited Administrator Klaxon, of all people, tasking him with regulating the energy output from the station's core to precise, fluctuating levels Marcus specified. Klaxon, the bureaucrat, was now manually adjusting a power grid to save a life. It was a beautiful, absurd sight. This reframed the entire debate from the Cub's surgery. That had been a battle of physicality against physics. This was a battle of will against metaphysics. It was the same philosophy, refusing to accept the inevitable, applied to a completely different set of rules. It proved the human way wasn't a single trick. It was a mindset. A core belief that impossible challenges don't reveal limitations. They reveal creativity. They force you to see tools where others see only obstacles, to see allies where others see only functionaries. Marcus directed the effort like a conductor of a very strange orchestra. Grumble would shift its mass, altering the dampening field. Vexy would call out fluctuations in the entity's fracturing thought patterns. Klaxon, sweating over his console, would nudge the power flow up or down a fraction. And Marcus? He stood at the center, his hands resting on the crystalline surface, not to perform surgery but to feel the vibrations of the struggle within. He was the central processor, taking in all the data, slime-based, crystalline, bureaucratic, and intuitive, and synthesizing it into commands. It was a level of interspecies cooperation that had no precedent. They weren't just following a procedure. They were composing one in real time. The willingness to push boundaries defined the moment. They were pushing physics, forcing energy to behave in ways the manuals said were inefficient. They were pushing ethics, blurring the line between healer and intervention in a way that made the review board's head spin. This was the human way in its purest form. A proactive, resourceful spirit that viewed rules not as laws, but as suggestions waiting to be improved upon. It was the belief that if you're not occasionally alarming the bureaucrats, you're probably not trying hard enough. The resolution was quiet but profound. The chaotic shimmer of the fracture lines began to steady. The sickly light faded, replaced by a stronger, more coherent glow. The entity's form, which had been on the verge of dissolving into constituent energy, held. It stabilized. It didn't heal completely. Some cracks remained, faint scars on its consciousness, but the fatal unraveling had stopped. The being was present, aware, saved. It was another victory for stubbornness, another redefinition of what was possible. The philosophy had been tested on a completely different kind of life form, a completely different kind of death, and it had worked. The legacy of that Zephyrin cub was already secure, but this proved it wasn't a fluke. It was a pattern, a very human, very disruptive, very effective pattern. The narrative didn't end with a grand celebration. It ended with Marcus already looking at the next incoming alert on the comm screen, a wry twist to his mouth. The work was never done. But the galaxy had its proof. The human approach could scale. It could adapt. The invitation to the conclave of impossible things wasn't just for one act of defiance. It was for a whole new way of seeing the universe. A way that said impossible is just a word and words can be rewritten. Across the whole arc of this thing, you get this weird mix of humor, sheer awe, and genuine heart. It's the constant contrast between human resilience and alien rationalism on full display. The Zephyrins have logic. The crystalline beings have perfect data streams. Humanity has this stubbornness, this refusal to accept a sad ending just because the math says it's polite. It's the difference between a perfectly reasoned eulogy and someone kicking down the door of the funeral home with a defibrillator. You see these recurring motifs start to mean something bigger. Not on my watch stops being just a cool thing a guy says. It becomes a whole philosophy. Same with aggressive optimism. These aren't just phrases you put on a motivational poster. They're a structured rebellion against inevitability itself. They're the operating system for a different way of seeing the universe, one where the final word hasn't been written until you're done fighting. The tension here isn't about surgery anymore. It's about these ideas taking root. It's watching a simple statement of defiance bloom into a school of thought. The invitation to the conclave of impossible things makes it official. They're not just honoring Marcus for saving a life. They're recognizing him as a catalyst for a full-blown paradigm shift. They're admitting that his kind of chaotic, hands-on, feeling-based intervention has a place at the table of high science. It's the universe begrudgingly making room for the wrench in its gears. This stubbornness, this human way, it acts as a kind of cosmic honesty check. The galaxy got comfortable with its limits. It built beautiful, efficient systems that worked perfectly within well-defined boundaries. Then humans show up and ask, why is that the boundary? And proceed to stomp right over it without waiting for an answer. They keep the universe intellectually honest. They're the living, breathing reminder that achievable is a fluid concept, constantly being redrawn by whoever is too determined to read the old map. That wounded cub's survival becomes more than just a medical success story. It turns into an emblem of cosmic hope. You look at it, now with its wings groomed and its eyes bright, and you don't just see a patient that recovered. You see a living argument. An argument that says no outcome is truly fixed. That fate is negotiable if you're willing to argue with it. It's a small, furry testament to the idea that death doesn't get the final say if life is still putting up a fight. The core argument the story makes is simple but profound. Willpower meeting ingenuity can rewrite any outcome. It's not about magic. It's about the sheer force of applied effort. It's the belief that a problem, no matter how complex, is just a collection of smaller problems waiting to be solved by someone too stubborn to be intimidated by the big picture. It's taking the immovable object and realizing you don't have to move it. You can just build a path around it, or tunnel under it, or convince a passing noble to help you lift it. This whole journey is the healer's path, but a specific kind. It's reluctant heroism against impossible odds. Marcus didn't set out to be a revolutionary. He just wanted to save his patient. The heroism was a side effect of his refusal to fail. It was the quiet, grinding, exhausting work of pushing back against the tide, not for glory but because turning your back felt worse. It's the most human kind of courage, the kind that shows up because it has to, not because it wants to. So the resolution isn't a tidy ending. It's an evolution. The human way, that messy blend of grit, empathy, and creative rule-breaking, becomes a universal lesson in perseverance. It's studied. It's debated. It's cautiously applied in other medbays across the galaxy. Other species start to look at their own hopeless cases a little differently. They might not have a human's particular brand of stubbornness, but they start to wonder if their own unique traits could be applied with the same defiant spirit. It becomes a lesson in not giving up, taught by the species that treats give up as a personal insult. What does it all mean in the end? It means the universe is a little less fixed than it was yesterday. It means a line has been drawn, not in the sand, but in the star charts. On one side, the clean, logical, predictable way of doing things. On the other, the messy, hopeful, stubborn human way. And the most important lesson of all is that sometimes the messy way works. Sometimes the only thing standing between a tragic end and a new beginning is someone who simply refuses to accept the first draft of reality. In the end, Marcus Webb's refusal to accept impossible didn't just save a cub. It challenged a galaxy to rethink the very nature of compassion. The Galactic Medical Review Board officially classified his methods as Experimental Protocol 1 Alpha Human, granting provisional authorization for what they dryly termed aggressive optimism therapy. It's now a testament to human stubbornness entered into their records. So remember, sometimes the most scientific thing you can do is refuse to quit, proving that willpower can be the most precise instrument in the toolbox when logic has already left the room.